2010, the body of Jack Wheeler was found in a landfill in Delaware. Police believe he was murdered, but by who and why? Let's investigate. If you enjoy mysteries, true crime, disappearances, and the occasional conspiracy, please feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. John P. Wheeler III, also known as Jack, had lived quite an eventful life. After a military career, he had been chairman of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, then senior planner for Amtrak, official of the Securities and Exchange Commission, chief executive and CEO of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, consultant to the MITRE Corporation, and a presidential aide to Ronald Reagan, George W. H. Bush, and George W. Bush administrations. He had also held numerous other positions in different corporations as well as in the US military and government. On the 31st of December 2010, his body was found in the Cherry Island Landfill in Delaware. At the time of his death, he lived with his wife, Catherine, who had last seen him alive a few days earlier on Boxing Day. After spending Christmas together in New York, Jack travelled to Washington, D.C. for work. It sounds like this wasn't planned as his wife was annoyed thinking they were going to the movies that day. He was supposed to return for New Year's Eve to attend a wedding he had been invited to, though he never did. It's hard to piece together an exact and precise timeline for what happened between Boxing Day and the 30th of December, though thanks to witness statements and CCTV, we have a general idea of Jack's actions prior to his death. After one day working in DC, phone records show him returning to his home in Newcastle City at around 5:30 p.m. on the 28th of December. A few hours later, police were called to investigate the house across the road as smoke bombs had been set off there. A phone was found in the grass right next to the home. We now know that phone belonged to Jack, though it seems that police either didn't find the phone straight away or at least didn't confirm whose phone it was, considering Jack wasn't taken in for questioning that night. It's not known for sure that Jack smoke bombed the house, though it does seem very likely considering his phone was found there. His wife Catherine tried to contact him the next day by phone, but of course got no answer. As far as I'm aware, Jack made no effort to contact her that day or the next. That morning, on the 29th, Jack contacted MITRE, where he was employed, to inform them that his house had been burgled. He said that items including his badge, wallet, briefcase and phone had been stolen. It's unclear whether there really had been a break-in at Jack's house. One of his neighbours later entered the home and reported to the police that it seemed like there'd been a burglary. He said that there were plates smashed in the sink and items thrown on the floor. To him it looked like a burglary. Though I'm no expert, but to me the scene that he described just didn't really sound like that. There was white powder on the floor with a barefoot footprint. If that wasn't Jack's, it would be pretty daft of a burglar to leave that there. I'm not actually sure if it was Jack's footprint, considering that was never mentioned in the Netflix documentary and I couldn't find that information anywhere else. We know that Jack's phone was found outside the house across the road. Unless the burglars went on to smoke bomb a house after stealing from Jack, it seems possible that Jack either fabricated the burglary or it did happen but they didn't take his phone. The fact that he didn't report the break-in to the police makes me wonder if it actually happened. He also didn't mention it to his wife either. At around 6 p.m. on the 29th, Jack visits the local pharmacy where he normally picks up his prescriptions. He mentioned that he needed a ride to Wilmington to get his car. A couple of people overheard and said they'd drop him off. Despite the drive typically taking around 15 minutes, it was 40 minutes later when he arrived at the car park. Though this wasn't where his car was, it was actually in a different car park a few blocks away. Jack had often driven to work and taken a taxi back in the past because he always forgot where he parked. He was seen on CCTV acting distressed, agitated, with one shoe off and the other in his hand ripped. He appeared paranoid, checking around corners and behind him as if he's being followed. He told the attendant there that his briefcase, which contained his parking ticket, had been stolen, but he didn't give any other information. The next day, Jack was seen on CCTV in the basement of an office complex in Wilmington. The Netflix show claimed that it's not known why he would go there. The only known link he had with that building was an appointment that he had years earlier. Though according to Washington Post, he asked to speak to a managing partner at a law firm there, but left before receiving a consultation. He did ask for money for the train fare though, which is strange considering he had money on him when he was at the car park. So unless he lost it or was mugged before he arrived at the office building, he probably had train fare at that point. It's also interesting to note that when Jack's body was found, he did have money on him, so it would suggest that unless he drew some money out since then, that he had money all along. Investigators found evidence to suggest that he spent the night at that building as well as part of the day. At 8:30 p.m, CCTV shows that Jack left the building wearing a dark-coloured hoodie. This was strange because no one had ever seen him wearing something like that. His family weren't aware of him owning any hoodies. Considering it didn't look like he was carrying a spare set of clothes on the CCTV, it's possible that he took the hoodie from one of the employees' lockers. He was last seen on CCTV walking down the road from the office building past a hotel. A witness later came forward claiming that around 11 p.m. that night, Jack shared a taxi after hearing it was heading to Newark, Delaware, around 14 miles away. It's not known why he would have wanted to go there. He had no known ties to the area. The next time anyone saw Jack was when his body was found at the landfill the next day. Police were able to trace the rubbish surrounding Jack's body back to Newark, where a couple of bins were tested for his DNA. One bin contained a partial match, so it was determined that Jack had been in that bin and that's how he'd arrived at the landfill. But how had he ended up in the bin? An autopsy concluded that Jack had been murdered, with the cause of death being blunt force trauma, likely as a result of assault. Injuries included a collapsed lung, broken ribs, external neck injuries, swollen lips, and lacerations, amongst others. It really looked like he'd been beaten to death. Money was found on Jack, as well as his Rolex watch and his valuable ring. As for theories, one popular theory is that Jack's murder was somehow related to his job or one of his previous jobs. Considering his previous positions, it's not impossible that he could have possessed knowledge on sensitive matters that certain people might not want making public. Considering Jack was pretty much never seen without his briefcase, many people believe that it might have contained something important, and if it was stolen as Jack claimed, maybe that was to keep whatever information might have been in there a secret. Maybe he was then killed to prevent him from discussing that with anybody. The CCTV footage shows Jack acting as if somebody's following him, and it has been suggested that when he was in the office building that he might have been hiding out, trying to evade someone. Now there's no evidence to suggest that anyone was hired to kill Jack, and also the way that he was killed, which was supposedly being beaten to death, also suggests against a professional hit. This would be a very unlikely method. There's also no evidence to suggest that Jack might have known anything that might have led to him being killed. Just because he always carried his briefcase on him doesn't mean that that contained information that would give someone a motive to murder him. If he really was being followed in Wilmington, how did they not get seen on CCTV? And if they even somehow managed to evade the cameras, how come they waited so long to kill him? Why not just do it at the earliest opportunity? Another theory is that Jack's neighbours might have killed him or hired someone to kill him after he smoke bombed their home. As I said before, it's not definitively known that Jack did smoke bomb the house, though it does seem very likely considering his phone was left at the scene and he had motive to do so. Jack openly opposed the house being built at that location on part of a historic battery park. He felt that it was offensive and insensitive to the area's history and to the soldiers that served there. He also tried to file a lawsuit against the owners of the house. I'm not really too sure what happened with it, whether it was dismissed before or after his death, but I don't think anything came of it in the end. He told people that he felt that corrupt officials were being paid off to allow the house to be built there, so the theory goes that either the house's owners or these corrupt officials had hired someone to kill him to silence him. Though as with the last theory, it does seem very unlikely that someone would follow him from Newcastle to Wilmington to Newark without being seen on any CCTV cameras, and also for reasons mentioned previously, it does seem very unlikely that it was a professional hit. Beyond a possible motive, there's no evidence to suggest that Jack's neighbours were involved in his death, and they've never been considered suspects. There's also no evidence to suggest that there was corruption in that area relating to anything that Jack was filing a lawsuit against. The final murder theory is that Jack was not targeted, but instead just randomly met with foul play, possibly a mugging gone wrong. Though a mugging does seem very unlikely considering that he had valuable items on him. If someone was trying to steal from him, why wouldn't they take those items? Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to and someone killed him for it, or he got into a fight and it just escalated, or maybe he was even a victim of a serial killer. There's no evidence to suggest this did or didn't happen, though I do feel like overall it is the most likely murder theory, just because with the other theories there's details that just cannot be explained. But what the theory doesn't explain is Jack's behaviour prior to his death, and that leads us into the final theory that Jack wasn't murdered at all and actually might have died as a result of an accident. I want to start this theory by stating that Jack was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not close to anyone who suffers with bipolar. Any knowledge that I have is purely just from my own research, so if I get anything wrong here, please feel free to correct me in the comments. After watching the Netflix episode, there wasn't a single shred of evidence that made me believe that Jack was murdered. It seems much more likely and more common for deaths to be ruled suicides or accidents when it actually could have been murdered than vice versa. And considering there are so many cases out there that I don't think ever completely got the investigation that they deserved because they were just passed off as a suicide or an accident, I'm kind of baffled as to how this case was ruled a murder. Though I do have a feeling, I mean again it's just speculation, that maybe the police might have just jumped the gun on this one. I mean from the off, like the autopsy was performed the same day that the body was found, which is quite unlikely. There were also so many investigative agencies involved so quickly, and I feel like they might have just reached that conclusion before fully considering the evidence. I think in many cases, possibly this one included, police and investigators and medical examiners don't like to admit that they were wrong. I think it's pretty rare for a case to be ruled a murder and evidence to be found to suggest that it was a suicide or an accident for them to then actually change the manner of death. It just kind of seems like once they've determined something that they tend to just stick with that even though there's often evidence to suggest otherwise. It's also likely that a lack of mental health awareness could have factored in here. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if police just thought that because Jack was a prominent figure, that he was a mature man and held various positions in his life, that he couldn't have succumbed to mental illness, that couldn't have led to his death. Some people just don't think things like that can happen to people like him. Before I really get into the theory and why I believe Jack's death was an accident, I do think it's important to note that it was really good that his death was investigated regardless. I do feel like there's too many cases that are just passed off because the victim was mentally ill, that murder sometimes isn't even considered. I feel like there are so many cases that just don't get the investigation they deserved because of that. I mean, in any case, no matter what the circumstances, if there's any chance, no matter how small, that a person might have been murdered, I feel like they deserve an objective investigation. That said, I'll now explain what I believe happened and why I don't believe that he was murdered. From the off, Jack's trip back to work in DC sounds like it wasn't planned. I mean, he had plans with his wife and then all of a sudden he just tells her that he's going back to work. I think this could have been the first, albeit subtle, sign that Jack might not have been in the best mental state. A detail Netflix left out is that Jack contacted his therapist after he and his wife had an argument about him leaving for work. He told the therapist that he felt dazed and boxed in a corner. Now, it's pretty hard to interpret these words without context, but it doesn't sound like Jack was in the best place after that argument. He did take medication for bipolar, though it is possible that he either missed a dose or just forgot to take it for a little while. His wife did say that this wasn't unlike him to forget to take his medication. I also remember hearing that in certain types of bipolar that sometimes even with medication that you can still have manic episodes, so it's not unlikely that this could have happened to Jack. I also heard that Jack had been hospitalised in 2004 for a worrying manic episode, so it does go to show that this kind of behaviour wasn't completely out of character for him. When he returned to his home in Newcastle, I believe that he did smoke bomb the house across the road, and I think he left his phone there, and when he realised, in a fit of anger at himself, could have just created the scene that the neighbour walked in on. Either that, or that he didn't realise that he'd left his phone across the road and ended up just turning the house upside down trying to find it. Either way, I really don't think that there was a break-in personally. As far as I'm aware, nothing else was stolen from the home, and it was only the kitchen that was a mess. I think he contacted his employer to tell them about the break-in, partly to explain the fact that his phone was missing, and also I believe that he could have already lost his briefcase at that point, so he needed an excuse for that. I don't think it's too unlikely that he could have left his briefcase on the train or something, and maybe either it was destroyed by the train company or someone else picked it up and maybe destroyed it once they realised that they were in possession of a dead man's belongings. After that, we know that he headed to the pharmacy to ask for a ride to Wilmington, which in itself is a little strange considering he had cash on him. Why not just call a taxi? The pharmacist also offered to call Jack a taxi, but he refused. After he was offered a lift, there's a 40-minute gap in the timeline. Some people believe something might have happened in this time, that he could have been beaten up or even jumped from a moving car to explain the fact that he was only wearing one shoe, but it's entirely possible that the drive took longer than Google would suggest. There could have been traffic or other hold-ups. The attendant at the car park noted that he wasn't bleeding or anything, so it seems unlikely that he was attacked prior to this or that he was in an accident before this point. The attendant also offered Jack money to get him home, but he declined. His behaviour at the car park looked very unusual, and considering we couldn't see anyone following him on the CCTV, I do believe that he was just being paranoid and, like I say, just in some kind of manic state. It really reminded me of the footage from the Elisa Lam case, which was almost definitely an accident. She also suffered from bipolar and just seemed to be acting really similar to how Jack was in the CCTV footage. I don't think Jack actually realised that he was in the wrong car park, and I found it a little worrying that his family just kind of passed this off as a little quirk that he had, that he was just so forgetful. But how often does the average person just forget where they've parked in a morning and have to get a taxi back as a result of this? That, paired with the fact that he often forgot to take his medication, as well as other things mentioned in the documentary, I do wonder if he might have possibly been in the early stages of dementia. And if that is the case, it could well have contributed to his strange behaviour that we've seen in the CCTV. I don't blame the family at all for not realising that these could be serious warning signs. I mean, quite often the family is the last people to actually realise that something isn't right with someone, but considering that they just seem to not even place any importance on that, it does make me wonder if they might have left other details out, or that they might not have considered certain things running up to his death that might have given a clue to his behaviour. It seems that Jack stayed in the office building overnight, which again is very strange. I mean, he was a pretty well-off man. Surely he would have had the money to get himself a hotel for the night if he needed somewhere to stay. When he ended up getting the taxi to Newark, I'm not even sure if he specifically wanted to go to Newark. I think it might have been more than just that he didn't want to be in Wilmington anymore. If he was paranoid that someone was following him, maybe he just wanted to get out of there. It didn't seem that he had a plan once he got there. As far as we're aware, he didn't have anywhere to go or anything to do there or anything, so it just seemed that he wanted to leave Wilmington. It could even be possible that he thought that the taxi was going to Newark, New Jersey, rather than Newark, Delaware. If he believed he was going to New Jersey, it might have been easier to make his way back to New York to his family from there. As far as I know, the taxi driver or the passenger have never been identified and spoken to. Him sharing a taxi with someone has not even been confirmed, it was just what a witness claims to have seen. It would have been close to midnight when Jack arrived in Newark. With it being December, with an average temperature of between 0 and 7 degrees, Jack would have been really cold without a coat. It doesn't seem unlikely to me that he might have climbed into the bin where his DNA was later found to keep warm and just to find shelter for a little while, I suppose. The bin man who featured in the Unsolved Mysteries episode said it wasn't uncommon for homeless people to do this, and that sometimes they'd realise before emptying the bin and sometimes not. In my opinion, the only strange thing about Jack's death was the injuries that he sustained, which were explained by a possible assault. But I think that these injuries could have been sustained by the bin that Jack was in being emptied into the truck. Now, I'm not too sure about bin collection in America or anything, but as far as I'm aware, I think some trucks have compactors and others don't. If this truck did have a compactor, to me it seems pretty likely that those injuries could have been caused by that. And even if not, being tossed into a truck on top of rubbish containing God knows what could have also caused pretty substantial injuries. I wouldn't even completely rule out the possibility of him maybe being hit by a car or something before he entered the bin. Maybe he was just kind of walking out into the road or something else happened that caused those injuries, and then he still voluntarily entered the bin and then it was emptied in the morning and that's what really killed him. I've also seen a couple of sources state that Jack suffered a heart attack as well. This wasn't mentioned in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, so I'm not too sure if it is accurate, but if so, that could have either been caused by just a random event or it could have been caused by the bin being emptied. Some sources do actually state that this was his cause of death, though I'm not 100% sure on that, as not all of the sources that I read did state that. When I started watching the Unsolved Mysteries episode and it said that his body was found on the landfill, I just kind of assumed that he'd been dumped there by someone, not that he'd arrived there with the rest of the rubbish after being in a rubbish bin. As soon as that point was clear, in my mind I was just pretty sure that this was an accident and not a murder. That's just my theory, it could absolutely be wrong, but it's the only theory that explains everything and doesn't make wild assumptions. I'm also not by any means saying that I know better than any investigators or medical examiners that came to this conclusion, but it's just my personal theory. For all I know, it could have been a combination of this theory as well as others. I mean, he could have still been attacked. Maybe someone just saw a vulnerable man and decided to take the opportunity. But I still think a manic episode explains his strange behaviour prior to his death. And I do think this theory sufficiently explains everything that we know about the case without anyone else necessarily being involved. I do feel like Netflix were pretty biased towards the murder theory in this episode, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, the official ruling was that he died from murder, but then if you look at the case of Joanne Romain, it was determined that she died of suicide, and the episode served to question that verdict. I mean, investigators and medical examiners are only human, I'm sure they make mistakes pretty often. It would have been good to get a more biased look at all the possible theories in this, but the episode just didn't really seem to mention the possibility that it could have been an accident. Though I do fully acknowledge that maybe some details and some theories might have been left out of respect to the family. I mean, if you're doing a documentary where the family are very involved in it, it does kind of put you in a difficult position in terms of what you mention and what you don't. If you have any information on the death of Jack Wheeler, please head to unsolved.com. So what do you think happened to Jack Wheeler? Do you think it was accidental, or do you think he really was murdered? And if so, by who? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on Saturday for a bonus Halloween video.